Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Elizabeth Smart. On June 5, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was asleep in her bedroom in the affluent town of Federal Heights, Salt Lake City, Utah, sharing the room with her sister Mary Katherine. As the night wore on, their peaceful slumber was shattered. A soft-spoken man, armed with a knife, forced open a window in the girl's room, disturbing Mary Katherine, who pretended to be asleep in an attempt to protect her sister. The intruder then turned to Elizabeth, ordering her to remain silent, threatening to harm her if she didn't comply. Fearing for her life, Elizabeth obeyed, putting on shoes before being taken outside the house. Meanwhile, Mary Katherine lay still for 2 hours, waiting for the perfect moment to alert her parents, Ed and Lois Smart. When she finally woke them up, she told them that someone had taken Elizabeth, but her parents were initially skeptical, thinking their daughter might have been dreaming. However, as the events began to unfold, they took Mary Katherine's story seriously. After inspecting Elizabeth and Mary Katherine's bedroom, Ed and Lois found a cut window screen which corroborated Mary Katherine's story. Concerned for Elizabeth's safety, Ed and Lois promptly notified the authorities. The police arrived at the Smart family home and questioned Mary Katherine about the man who had abducted Elizabeth from their bedroom. Mary Katherine described the abductor as having dark hair on his arms and the backs of his hands. Although the man had spoken quietly to Elizabeth during the incident, Mary Katherine could still identify his voice as somehow familiar, even though she couldn't recall any specific occasion when she had heard it before. About 3.5 hours after Elizabeth was taken, the authorities used the Racial Alert system to broadcast information about her abduction to the public. The Racial Alert, named after a Utah girl who was abducted and murdered, enabled the authorities to rapidly disseminate information to a wide audience and enlist the public's help in locating Elizabeth. The police investigated people who had toured the Smart family's home, which was up for sale, as potential suspects in Elizabeth's abduction since she had been taken from her bedroom on June 5, 2002. Additionally, they searched the family's computer, seeking any online interactions Elizabeth may have had with strangers, as this was a common tactic used in child abduction cases. The day after Elizabeth's kidnapping, her devastated parents, Ed and Lois, made a heartfelt and emotional appeal on national television, pleading for her safe return. Ed addressed the perpetrator directly, his voice filled with desperation and love, asking them to bring their daughter home. With tears in his eyes, he begged the person responsible to have mercy and return Elizabeth safely, expressing his immense love for his daughter and his unwavering commitment to finding her. In Federal Heights, the police interviewed Elizabeth's neighbors, but none of them reported seeing or hearing anything unusual on the day she was abducted. The lack of information was surprising to the police, who had hoped to gather more leads to aid the investigation. Following Elizabeth's abduction, Rocky Anderson, the mayor of Salt Lake City, made a public announcement offering an initial reward of $10,000 for her safe return to her family. This amount was later increased to $250,000. A massive search effort was launched, with nearly 12,200 volunteers joining Elizabeth's family and friends to look for her. However, at a news conference, the police admitted that despite receiving thousands of tips, their progress in the case was limited. The authorities in Salt Lake City solicited assistance from other police departments statewide, but lacked crucial evidence, such as a vehicle description, to pursue significant leads. As a result, the investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance stagnated, causing frustration among law enforcement officials. Captain Scott Atkinson of the Salt Lake City Police Department publicly stated that all individuals were still suspects in Elizabeth's abduction, while reaffirming that her family was not the primary focus of the investigation. A volunteer searching for Elizabeth reported a suspicious man to the police after spotting him in a wooded canyon. The volunteer described the man's suspicious behavior, prompting the police to launch an overnight search. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find the man and eventually dismissed the tip as not credible. The police also received a tip from a local milkman in Federal Heights. He claimed to have seen a man driving an older gray Honda or Nissan on Elizabeth Street a day or two before her disappearance. The milkman said he felt uneasy about the driver and wrote down the license plate number. However, when the police checked their database for the license plate number, they couldn't find any relevant information or leads, so they dismissed the tip as not viable. The police officers investigating Elizabeth Smart's abduction faced a significant challenge due to the large number of people who gathered at the Smart residence in the hours immediately following her abduction. When the police arrived at the scene around 4 a.m., they found the home already crowded with people, which compromised the integrity of any potential evidence. As the search for Elizabeth Smart continued, the police questioned a man who had interacted with her at a social event prior to her abduction. However, they soon cleared him of any suspicion and determined he had no involvement in her disappearance. The search efforts intensified, with over 20 volunteer pilots flying their private planes over the Salt Lake area, but unfortunately, these efforts yielded no results. Tracking dogs picked up a scent in Red Boot Canyon, several miles from Elizabeth's home, but police searched the area and found nothing. The search for Elizabeth had taken a toll on her father, Ed Smart, who was on the verge of exhaustion. He collapsed from the strain and was taken to the hospital, but was released a few hours later and continued searching for his daughter. Ed and his wife, Lois, were utterly exhausted, unable to sleep, and barely holding on. In a media interview, Ed expressed his frustration and determination to find Elizabeth, stating that they were holding on to hope that their daughter was alive and would soon return home to them. Despite their exhaustion, Ed and Lois Smart remained hopeful that Elizabeth would come back to them. Elizabeth's mother, Lois Smart, publicly declared her love and devotion to her daughter through a heartfelt statement to the media, saying, "Elizabeth, if you can hear us, we love you." Her loved ones gathered for a candlelight vigil, praying for her safe return home. Following Elizabeth's abduction, the police asked her father, Ed, to take a polygraph test, which he willingly agreed to, demonstrating his family's cooperation in aiding the authorities to locate their daughter. The investigation subsequently ruled out the possibility that Elizabeth had staged her own disappearance and confirmed that she did not run away. Police got a tip about Brett Michael Edmonds, who was sighted in Federal Heights around Elizabeth's abduction time. They looked for him but couldn't find him. He'd moved to New Mexico and Texas. After a chase, they caught a guy who looked like him, but it wasn't him. The police eventually located Brett Michael Edmonds in West Virginia, where he had been hospitalized due to an overdose and liver failure. Although his health was critical, and there were fears he might not survive, his condition stabilized enough to allow authorities to question him about Elizabeth's abduction. In a fortunate turn of events, Brett was conscious, alert, and able to speak, enabling the police and FBI agents to interview him. During the interview, Brett fully cooperated with the authorities, who ultimately concluded that he was not involved in Elizabeth's abduction. After Brett Michael Edmonds was cleared as a suspect in Elizabeth's abduction, police turned their attention to 48-year-old Richard Albert Ritchie. Elizabeth's father, Ed Smart, informed police that he had employed Richard at his home for 2 months the previous year. Ed said that since Richard didn't own a vehicle, they made a deal. Ed would give Richard his 1990 Jeep Cherokee in exchange for his labor. However, Ed was unaware that Richard Ritchie was a career criminal, and he later stated that if he had known about Richard's background, he wouldn't have hired him. Richard Ritchie's criminal history dates back to 1973, when he was convicted of second-degree felony burglary, marking the start of a string of offenses over several decades. In 1981, he was convicted of burglary for a separate incident. His most serious crime, occurred in 1983 when he was sent to prison for aggravated robbery and attempted murder after wounding a police officer during a gunfire exchange with authorities during a drugstore robbery. Additionally, Richard Ritchie was convicted of theft in 1996 for stealing approximately $2,500 worth of food from a food pantry in Richfield. Corrections records show that Richard Ritchie was paroled in September 2000. In a media interview, Ed Smart expressed doubts about Richard Ritchie's involvement in his daughter Elizabeth's abduction. Despite Ritchie's criminal history, Ed initially thought him a capable worker. On June 14, 2002, Richard Ritchie was arrested for a parole violation. The police could not confirm his whereabouts on the day Elizabeth was abducted. Richard Ritchie denied any involvement through his attorney and stated that the police had thoroughly searched his home, including digging up his garden. Despite this, no evidence related to Elizabeth's abduction was found. Ritchie claimed he fully cooperated with the police, providing blood samples for DNA comparison and sitting through 26 hours of interviews. He also handed over his vehicle for investigation. By July 2002, Elizabeth Smart had been missing for a month, and her family was desperate for her return. When police received a report of a girl matching Elizabeth's description in Nebraska under suspicious circumstances, they thought their prayers had been answered. A gas station witness reported seeing a crying girl, aged 12 to 14, who seemed to be held against her will in a minivan. The witness provided a detailed description that matched Elizabeth's appearance. This news sent shockwaves through the Smart family, who eagerly hoped for any lead that might help find their missing daughter. However, a thorough police investigation revealed that the report was unrelated to Elizabeth's abduction. Despite a thorough search, police found no evidence linking the sighting to Elizabeth's case. This disappointment left the Smart family struggling with mixed emotions as they continued to hope for Elizabeth's safe return while acknowledging the possibility of false leads. Undeterred, the Smart family remained determined to find Elizabeth, maintaining a cautious optimism. They refused to rule out the possibility that the girl at the gas station was Elizabeth, but stated that they needed to keep an open mind. The family spokesperson clarified that while they weren't necessarily holding out hope that it was Elizabeth, they would be overjoyed if it were. Richard Ritchie, the main suspect in Elizabeth's disappearance, was charged with theft and burglary in two separate incidents. One incident occurred on April 4, 2001, when he allegedly stole items from a house in the Federal Heights neighborhood, which is a second-degree felony and a Class A misdemeanor. The other incident happened on June 6, 2001, when he allegedly stole jewelry and a perfume bottle valued at approximately $3,500 from the Smart family home, which is a third-degree felony. Ritchie pleaded not guilty to these charges. The stolen items were not related to Elizabeth's kidnapping investigation. Salt Lake District Attorney David Yoakum announced the charges at a press conference, stating that Ritchie had denied the theft allegations and was subsequently fired from his job. In August 2002, the police investigation into Elizabeth Smart's abduction hit a major roadblock when Richard Ritchie, their best lead, died from a severe brainstem injury that caused bleeding. Ritchie's condition worsened rapidly, leaving him unable to communicate or breathe on his own. His family made the painful decision to take him off life support in a last-ditch effort to save his life. Although doctors operated to remove a blood clot from his brain and relieve pressure on his brainstem, the damage was too extensive and their efforts were in vain. Despite this setback, the authorities persisted in their search for Elizabeth Smart's abductor. However, Ritchie's death posed a significant obstacle to the investigation, undermining confidence in other leads and hindering progress in the case. In August 2002, a horrific crime was committed when an 11-year-old girl was taken from her bedroom and subjected to sexual assault and brutal beating. The severity of her injuries was appalling, with every bone in the middle of her face broken, as revealed by hospital doctors. She required surgery, but sadly, her condition remained critical after the attack. The police investigation led to the arrest of Javier Sickler, a close friend of the girl's father, who was charged with aggravated burglary, aggravated assault, and attempted murder. Javier Sickler claimed that he remembered knocking on the front door of the victim's home, but alleged that he lost consciousness afterward. Despite initial similarities with the Elizabeth Smart abduction case, the police established that Javier Sickler was not involved in her kidnapping. As the search for Elizabeth Smart dragged on, the police began to explore unconventional approaches. They consulted psychics, individuals claiming to possess extrasensory perception that could uncover clues about her location. One tip from these psychics suggested that Elizabeth might be buried in a crypt in the foothills above Salt Lake City. This prompted a Seattle-based company to step forward, claiming that over a dozen of its members had pinpointed Elizabeth's body using a technique called technical remote viewing. According to these individuals, their psychic powers had revealed that Elizabeth was killed within hours of her abduction. However, when the police investigated the alleged tomb, they found no evidence of Elizabeth's whereabouts. In November 2002, Walter Kenneth Holloway was arrested after claiming to be the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart and demanding a $3 million ransom from her parents, Ed and Lois Smart. Holloway contacted the Smart family and the Salt Lake Police Department, threatening to harm Elizabeth if he didn't receive the money. However, the police tracked him down to South Carolina and found no evidence linking him to her abduction. Ed Smart was outraged by the extortion scheme, which he felt diverted police attention away from finding his daughter and wasted resources that could have been used to locate her. In October 2002, Elizabeth's sister Mary Katherine had a sudden realization. The voice of the abductor was identical to that of Emmanuel, an unemployed man the family had briefly hired to work on their roof and rake leaves in their yard. Although the police were initially skeptical, due to the short duration of Emmanuel's employment with the family, the long delay between the abduction and Mary Katherine's revelation, and her limited exposure to the abductor's voice, the family decided to have a sketch artist draw Emmanuel's likeness based on their descriptions. The resulting sketch was finally released in February 2003 and received widespread media attention, featuring on prominent television shows such as Larry King Live and America's Most Wanted. Relatives of a man named Brian David Mitchell identified a suspect drawing released by the police. They provided contemporary photographs of him, which helped authorities verify that the sketch was an accurate likeness. On March 12, 2003, two couples in Sandy, Utah, recognized Brian David Mitchell walking with a woman and a girl who they knew from the news as the missing girl's abductor. The woman accompanying Mitchell was later identified as his wife, Wanda Berry. The couples quickly called the police, and officers were sent to the location. After questioning, the missing girl from Salt Lake City, Elizabeth Smart, was confirmed to be present. The officers then rescued her and arrested both Mitchell and Berry. Elizabeth provided a shocking account of being abducted, abused, and held captive. Brian David Mitchell had taken her from her home to an encampment outside Salt Lake City. The camp was a makeshift shelter hidden by dense foliage for camouflage. There, she met Wanda Barzy, Mitchell's wife, who played a significant role in her captivity. At first, Wanda Barzy acted like a caring mother figure, offering Elizabeth comfort and warmth. However, as the weeks passed, Barzy's behavior changed dramatically. She began controlling Elizabeth, forcing her to follow their strange religious beliefs. Barzy demanded that Elizabeth pray, read scriptures, and take part in religious rituals. Elizabeth faced a highly traumatic experience during her captivity when she was forced to marry Brian David Mitchell against her will. Wanda Barzy threatened her with physical harm if she refused to comply with their demands. The wedding ceremony, which Mitchell pretended was a symbol of eternal love, was actually a sham with no legal validity, serving only to reinforce Brian David Mitchell's control over Elizabeth. After forcing Elizabeth into marriage, Brian David Mitchell began assaulting her. He claimed he was a Davidic king, tasked by a higher power to kidnap virgins to fight the Antichrist, as a justification for his actions. During her captivity, Elizabeth suffered unimaginable abuse, including being chained to a tree with a metal cable that severely restricted her movement and prevented her from escaping. In addition to physical restraint, Elizabeth was also subjected to psychological manipulation. She was forced to take the new name Esther, inspired by the biblical figure, which symbolized the loss of her identity and the control exerted over her by Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. Elizabeth was repeatedly sexually assaulted by Brian David Mitchell, leaving her traumatized and fearful. She was also forced to look at explicit magazines, further worsening her trauma and degradation. Throughout her ordeal, Elizabeth was constantly threatened with violence and even death, leaving her in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. To weaken Elizabeth's resistance, Mitchell frequently forced her to consume alcohol and take drugs, exploiting these substances to break down her defenses and make her more susceptible to his control. The constant intoxication left her disoriented, vulnerable, and disconnected from reality, making it easier for her captors to commit their atrocities. Moreover, Elizabeth was subjected to starvation and fed scraps by her captors. After her rescue, Elizabeth described Wanda Barzee as the most evil woman she had ever encountered. Following years of legal proceedings, Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty to all charges related to Elizabeth's abduction and was sentenced to concurrent 15-year terms in state and federal prison in 2016. Her federal imprisonment was eventually terminated, and she was transferred from the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, to the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, to begin serving her state prison sentence. Elizabeth Smart spoke out against the release of Wanda Barzee in September 2018, despite which Barzee was still set free. At the time, Smart, an advocate for child safety, expressed concern that Barzee still posed a threat to others, citing her lack of remorse and signs of rehabilitation. The controversy surrounding Barzee's release drew media attention and highlighted ongoing concerns about the parole of convicted criminals. After years of legal battles, Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping Elizabeth Smart. During the hearing, Elizabeth addressed her kidnapper directly, delivering a powerful and emotional statement. She described the pain and trauma he had inflicted, telling him that the 9 months in captivity had taken an irreplaceable part of her life. Despite this, Elizabeth showed remarkable resilience and determination, vowing to lead a good life despite the darkness he had brought into her life. Her words reflected her strength and determination to overcome her challenges. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you before. The story began on a Saturday evening in July 2011, during a dance lesson when Dr. Joseph Sonier, a respected and wealthy pathologist, first met Michelle Tina. A prominent figure in his city and beyond, Joseph was a single man enjoying freedom, status, money, and a life of distinction. Michelle was nearly 10 years his junior, successful in her own right, and living a life of pleasure. Their meeting on the dance floor marked the beginning of what would become a passionate romance, a relationship that tragically ended in tears. At that moment, as their ideal partnership on the dance floor blossomed into tender love, no one could have foreseen the events that would follow. Dr. Joseph Sonier's biography before meeting Michelle is filled with both joys and tragedies. Born in 1955 into a well-regarded medical family in Shreveport, Louisiana, he aspired from childhood to continue his family's legacy and become a doctor. With remarkable abilities, young Joseph earned a Bachelor of Science in Medical Science from Louisiana State University, LSU, in Baton Rouge in 1976. He then pursued further studies at LSU in Shreveport while commencing work at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Balancing university studies with work commitments skillfully, Joseph aimed to achieve exceptional professionalism in his chosen field. Constantly taking on additional workloads at university and honing his practical knowledge at the hospital, he caught the attention of the management for his dedication and proficiency. In his final year of training, Joseph was appointed chief resident. Upon completing his studies, Dr. Sonier chose to specialize in pathologic anatomy and later became an esteemed pathologist and laboratory director in Lubbock, Texas. Tragically marked by personal loss, Dr. Sonier endured the end of a 27-year marriage, a union he had believed to be happy, when his wife fell in love with another man. Demonstrating strong character and nobility, Joseph accepted her choice and agreed to divorce her. Even though this phase was challenging for him, both personally and professionally, Dr. Sonier maintained his reputation for integrity and responsibility throughout his career and life endeavors. After the divorce, he kept a very warm relationship with Becky and continued to support his two sons. He showed resilience and strength of character. When Becky died 2 years later at the hands of her new husband Joseph, he was shocked by the heinous death of his former spouse. Once again, he experienced a wave of grief and loss, repeatedly recalling the family years gone by and mourning the loss. However, the doctor remained a pillar for the family. He took over all the organizational issues and funeral expenses immediately, helping his sons survive the trauma. The children later admitted that it was his support that helped each of them overcome the pain. The tragedy left a deep mark on Joseph's heart. For a while, he fully devoted himself to work and raising his two sons. Later, the grief he experienced led to a reassessment of life. The man decided to start a new personal chapter in a new city and with a new woman. In 2007, Dr. Sonier moved with his sons from Dallas to Lubbock, Texas, where he accepted a position as chief pathologist at Covenant Health System. Feeling the need for something fresh to fill the void inside him, Joseph enrolled in a local dance studio. He enjoyed those classes also because it was where he met different women. A couple of times, he even tried, unsuccessfully, to build relationships with his dance partners. Then one warm summer evening, Michelle Tina appeared at the dance class. An elegant, graceful woman with a sense of humor and lively eyes attracted Dr. Sonier's attention instantly. Her smile lit up the room and Joseph realized she was exactly who he had been looking for. Michelle also noticed this confident and respectful man moving deftly on the dance floor. She was 47 and Joseph was 57 when they paired up perfectly in dance. With each passing session, they realized they were growing closer. Dr. Sonier suggested dating, and Michelle agreed. Thus began what seemed then like a happy new chapter in both their lives. Michelle had an attractive, innate charm that had such a strong influence on men that they were willing to change their lives for her, even destroy marriages or commit criminal acts for her satisfaction. Rochelle was one of those women possessing a distinct magnetism that naturally draws attention and ignites passion. In reality, both were embarking on new lives with fresh starts after personal romantic upheavals. Departing from Amarillo, Dr. Sonier's new partner was fleeing the fear and anxiety linked with Mike Dixon, owner of a private clinic specializing in plastic surgery and cosmetology. The woman met Mike in 2008 when she visited his clinic for Botox injections. Initially, their interactions were strictly friendly. However, what began as light flirtation soon evolved into a romance. Rochelle was a free, accomplished woman who had built a successful career as an executive in the NFL and did not need anything. Her 4 children were grown, and she owed no one anything. In contrast, Mike was bound by marriage commitments. The plastic surgeon began leading a double life, which came to light a few months later when his wife discovered the affair and filed for divorce after 20 years of marriage. Mike was so captivated by Rochelle that he almost didn't realize how significant a stage of his life was ending. He decisively separated from his wife for Rochelle. Interestingly, Rochelle never intended to marry Mike. She sought only joy and ease from the relationship. The affair required Rochelle to be equally obsessed with her partner, which did not align with her expectations. Unable to get the attention he desired, Mike attempted to pressure Rochelle, a tactic that only drove her away. Recognizing his manipulative tactics and desire to control her life entirely, the young woman decided to part ways with the plastic surgeon. By 2010, their paths had diverged significantly. Nonetheless, even after their breakup, Mike persistently pursued Rochelle, urging her to return. This behavior compelled Rochelle to move away, to vanish from his sight, and free herself from his oppressive influence. This is how Rochelle found herself in Lek. Dr. Sonier and Rochelle quickly bonded. Their relationship gradually blossomed into genuine love. Dr. Sonier's relatives warmly accepted Rochelle and celebrated the partnership's positive impact on Joseph's life. He spared no expense for her, showering her with gifts, inviting her to elite restaurants and private clubs within the city, and even taking her on trips together. After Joseph realized he had finally found a woman he was ready to spend his life with, he took her to Lois. In the presence of his entire family, he proposed. At that moment, Rochelle was 47 years old and was absolutely enamored with her new partner. Her social media pages were almost daily filled with love declarations to Joseph. Naturally, Mike Dixon couldn't help but notice these posts. The former lover was emotionally devastated to learn that Rochelle not only had a new man, but also openly confessed her love for him and intended to marry him. He understood that winning back his old flame would be impossible. Despite this realization, he attempted to propose a renewed arrangement where they would at least become lovers again. However, Rochelle firmly rejected the notion and informed Joseph about the incident. Soon after, the couple began to feel as though they were being watched. At one point, they even noticed something resembling a camera flash through their backyard window, but didn't give it much thought, not fully grasping the potential seriousness of the situation. Things took a dire turn on July 11, 2012. A landscaper arrived at Joseph's home to discuss an upcoming project and discovered an open door when trying to contact him. Assuming Joseph might not hear him, he entered the house and found it in disarray. Most concerning was a bullet hole near the front door, suggesting an intruder may have been involved. The landscaper cautiously ventured further into the home in search of Joseph, and then checked the garage. There he found Joseph's son lying lifeless in a pool of blood with no signs of life. His body showed evidence of both stabbing and gunshot wounds. Concluding that the perpetrator might still be nearby, the landscape designer immediately exited the house and called for help. At 2:48 p.m. that day, police received a call and dispatched several patrol cars to the scene immediately. Arriving officers identified the victim as Joseph Sonier, a 57-year-old pathologist. Medical personnel on site confirmed his death. The incident profoundly shocked the public, as it occurred in one of the city's most peaceful, safe, and upscale neighborhoods with virtually no crime history. Dr. Sonier, a well-regarded member of his profession, was known for his calm demeanor and kindness, and had no known enemies who might wish him harm. Despite a broken window, it was clear this was not a robbery. Nothing was missing from the house. A bottle with its bottom shot off was found at the scene, likely used as an improvised silencer for a firearm. Shortly after discovering the scene, a forensic team arrived to collect evidence. The agent in charge appeared inexperienced, leaving several traces behind. DNA from the silencer and blood samples were sent to a lab for further testing. Neighbors told detectives they neither saw nor heard anything suspicious, and there were no CCTV cameras nearby. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator entered through a panoramic window overlooking the backyard, making his attack unpredictable. Inside the dining room, he confronted Dr. Sonier and began shooting. The wine bottle was probably used as a silencer during this time. Blood traces in the hallway suggested that Dr. Sonier was still alive after being shot. He moved to the garage where his attacker caught him and inflicted several stab wounds. An autopsy discovered 5 gunshot wounds and 11 stab wounds, indicating premeditated intent rather than a random act of violence. What remained unclear was who committed this heinous crime and their motive. The investigation focused on Dr. Sonier's close social circle. His fiancée recounted strange events in their lives in recent months before the tragedy. She believed Dr. Sonier had been stalked and mentioned seeing an unfamiliar person watching their home and windows. Michelle also described receiving persistent calls and texts before Dr. Sonier's death. Officers verified this information, but suspected these communications might have come from other women with whom Dr. Sonier appeared to have parallel relationships, since witnesses claimed he was in contact with several women simultaneously. Investigators inquired with Michelle to see if she was aware of the other women involved. She claimed she was unaware. Joseph's sons firmly refuted the notion that their father could have had mistresses, asserting that infidelity was contrary to his character. Nonetheless, investigators continued exploring a theory that jealousy might have motivated the crime. During the next interrogation, Rachel broke under pressure, cried, and admitted knowing several women who might be linked to the incident. She mentioned that numerous former girlfriends continued to stalk Joseph. He ignored these women, but they consistently displayed displeasure regarding his upcoming wedding. One such woman from Florida persistently called even after Dr. Sonier disclosed his serious relationship with Rachel. Another individual, a nurse and colleague of the pathologist, regularly reached out to him as well. A third woman, who had a daughter, sent a letter accusing Joseph of abandoning them shortly before his murder. In this same interview, Michelle mentioned Mike Dixon for the first time. Until now, she hadn't connected her and Joseph's surveillance to Mike. Since he had ceased all attention after her refusal to be his mistress, she assumed he had accepted her marriage and moved on with life. The police now had a potential suspect and sought to question Mike Dixon further. Mike willingly spoke with detectives and confessed that he had been deeply in love with Rachel, having even divorced his wife in pursuit of a future with her. The separation affected him greatly. He tried for a while to win Rachel back, but eventually accepted her decision. He then found someone new, a much younger medical student, who confirmed his alibi. He was at work during the crime and spent time with her afterward. Despite this lead, the investigation encountered several obstacles. All suspects, including Michelle herself, had solid alibis. Detectives attempted to identify possible enemies of the victim or individuals who might have had financial motives tied to his death, but faced challenges at every turn. No new figures emerged by the time the lab results were back. The situation seemed to hit a dead end. Unfortunately, the forensic results didn't add any clarity either. The DNA sample from the bottle didn't match the victim, and the police database couldn't identify whose DNA was found at the crime scene. Then, enforcement officials caught an unusual break. The police department received a call from Paul, an aspiring EMT from Amarillo. He shared that he was living with a buddy named Dave Shepard, who had recently confessed to committing a murder in Leck, and then attempted to take his own life but was saved. Paul provided detailed information given by a neighbor about the crime, including specifics known only to a select group of detectives, such as the use of a bottle muffler. Realizing that Shepard was indeed involved in the crime, officers pursued this lead. The caller claimed that Dave was just the perpetrator and that the mastermind behind the crime was an unknown doctor tied to plastic surgery. Immediately, officers started running a background check on this new suspect and discovered Shepard's violent criminal history. His record showed theft and hooliganism, but didn't include any major crimes. They identified him as divorced, unemployed, and involved in several theft incidents, one involving stealing $330,000 from a prominent businessman. Dave was brought in for questioning and soon started to confess. He confirmed that Mike Dixon had hired him for the crime. According to Dave, they met at a bar where both men were dealing with painful breakups with their partners. Under the influence of alcohol, their conversation took a turn into what became an established friendship. Mike Dixon shared his sad love story and complained about Rachel, who had left him and was now about to marry someone else. The man shared that he can't get over his former partner and is willing to do anything to get her back. Deciding that the only obstacle is Dr. Sonier, Mike and Dave devised a plan. However, their intentions, according to Dave, did not include murder. They merely wanted to slander the pathologist so that Rachel would leave him and return to Mike. First of all, they found women who were paid handsome sums of money $1,000 each, to play the role of mistresses and pursue Dr. Sonier. Then came a letter from a woman with a child, claiming that Joseph had abandoned her. Dr. Sonier denied it each time, and Rachel believed him. It also turned out that the camera flash the couple had seen was the light from Dave's cell phone flashlight. He regularly drove to their house and pretended to conduct surveillance. Each such trip was financed by Mike Dixon, who handed out money for gas and related expenses. When spying and slander failed to separate the lovers, Mike set out to fix the problem in a more radical way. He confided in his friend that he wanted him to kill the pathologist. As payment, Dixon offered 3 silver bars totaling about $110,000. Dave agreed, with one of the bars given as a deposit. The hired killer immediately cashed it in at a pawn shop. According to Dave Shepard, when he arrived at Dr. Sonier's house, things got out of control. It was in shooting. "I got scared," Dave explained, and he started walking away down the hallway. "When I came to my senses from the shock, I shouted, 'Dr. Sonier, are you all right?' Hearing nothing back, I followed him into the garage where he was lying." Dave distinctly heard his last breath and bent down to check his pulse. There was no pulse. In his confession, Shepard claimed that he allegedly stabbed Joseph Sonier in an irrational and foolish attempt to cover up what he called involuntary manslaughter. "I stabbed him a couple times. I don't remember how many times. You say I stabbed 11 times? I had Dr. Sonier's phone in my hand and thought about dialing the emergency number for help, but didn't. Maybe that's why it happened 11 times. Mutilated the remains, then went to Mike's place where I got the rest of the bullion and tried to end my own life," said Dave, concerning agreeing to commit this crime. He did not fully grasp what he was agreeing to, and when he found himself in front of Joseph, he realized that he could not go through with the act. If not for an accidental gunshot, Dr. Sonier would still be alive today. The plastic surgeon was apprehended by police on the same day and charged with first-degree murder based on Dave's testimony and a comprehensive collection of other evidence, including compromising phone calls and text messages containing explicit confessions. During the first interview, detectives hoped to elicit a confession, but Mike Dixon resolutely denied everything, demanding legal representation. A lawsuit ensued. Dave Sheard, as part of a deal with the prosecutor, immediately pleaded guilty to his role as a hired criminal and waived the right to appeal his sentence. Consequently, instead of facing the death penalty, he received a life sentence without parole. Mike Dixon, against whom there was only circumstantial evidence, pleaded not guilty. In an unexpected turn during the trial, Dave, who was a key witness for the prosecution, testified that he committed the crime alone without Dixon's involvement. Under oath, he claimed that the silver bars were intended for investment in a business they had planned to start together. The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, which led to a retrial being declared. In 2016, during the second trial, Dixon was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, an appeal filed by his lawyers resulted in the reversal of this judgment. Consequently, Dixon was released on bail set at $2 million. The fight for justice persisted as the prosecutor's office sought to have his sentence reinstated by the highest criminal court of the state. The prosecutor's motion, filed on February 11, 2019, was granted in April 2020. Subsequently, Dixon's bail was revoked and an arrest warrant issued again. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed this lower court decision and reinstated Mike Dixon's sentence. It ruled that he must continue serving his life sentence without parole. Mike Dixon remains incarcerated in a prison in Texas. Dr. Joseph Sonier became entangled in this tragic series of events when he began dating Michelle in July 2011. She still regards him as the main love of her life and deeply regrets that she unknowingly led a criminal to such an honest and loving man. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Crystal Perry. Crystal Perry was born on August 23, 1963, in the small American town of Rumford, Maine. She was the youngest of 10 children and their parents had to provide for all of them, which was understandably a challenge. Crystal and her siblings grew up quite independently with strict parents, unable to watch over all the kids. Their older sister, who was just 12 when Crystal was born, took care of them like a mother, always looking out for her younger brothers and sisters. Growing up in a tense environment, they all wanted to start their own separate lives as soon as possible. Eventually, they scattered to different cities and states. Crystal was no exception. She wanted to start a family of her own and met a guy named Tom in high school. They soon got married and moved to California, but eventually, Crystal realized that big city life just wasn't for her. After a year and a half, they decided to return to Maine, settling in a small town called Bridgeton, about an hour away from her hometown. Crystal got a job at a local shoe shop, while Tom took on various odd jobs. Soon, Crystal discovered she was pregnant, and they welcomed their daughter, Sarah. Despite the fact that Tom had initially wanted to be a father, their relationship with Crystal became complicated after their daughter's birth. He spent more and more time at a local bar, squandering almost all their money on alcohol. Once, he even took the money Crystal had set aside for groceries, as they didn't earn much. Tom's drinking habit sometimes left them with no money even for food. At some point, Crystal decided to file for divorce. Tom continued to see his daughter from time to time, but wasn't actively involved in her life. The situation escalated when Tom got a new girlfriend, who started to harass Crystal. She called and threatened Crystal, show up at her place, and cause scenes, all because she simply didn't like that Crystal and Tom had once been married. Afraid to let Sarah visit her father, Crystal moved in with her mother. Over the years, she worked hard to save enough money to buy a house of her own. A few years later, she finally had the opportunity and purchased a small house on the outskirts of Bridgeton. The house was located just a few dozen yards from a picturesque lake surrounded by a forest. Crystal and Sarah were thrilled to have their own home just for the two of them. On May 10, 1994, when Crystal was 30 and Sarah was 12, they watched a solar eclipse together. The next day, as usual, Crystal went to work and Sarah to school. In the evening, they had dinner together, and Crystal tucked her daughter into bed. A few hours later, Sarah suddenly woke up to a loud scream. At first, she thought her mom was arguing with someone on the phone, but she quickly realized it was much more serious. Crystal was screaming at the top of her lungs, and Sarah immediately thought someone was attacking her mom. The door to her bedroom was slightly ajar, and through her fear, she came closer to it. Sarah realized that the screams were coming from the kitchen, but she couldn't see what was happening from where she stood. Sarah was gripped by fear and afraid to move or make any sound. After a few seconds, she heard footsteps and thought that whoever had attacked her mom was coming for her. She hid behind the bed, waiting for her door to swing open at any moment. Instead, she heard the kitchen drawer open, followed by a sound like someone was rummaging through the silverware. Crystal continued to scream and beg for mercy, and in the next few seconds, Sarah heard sounds as if someone had started stabbing her mom with a knife. With each new stab wound, her cries became increasingly muffled until they stopped completely. Despite being only 12, Sarah understood clearly that some unknown criminal was killing her mom. She wanted to rush to her mother's aid, but was paralyzed with fear. Sarah also realized that she had no chance against the knife-wielding person, and they would likely just kill her too. After her mother's screams stopped, Sarah couldn't move for several minutes. She waited for the criminal to come to her room, but the house was eerily silent. She finally left her room and went to the kitchen, where she encountered a disturbing scene. The lights were off, and the room was only illuminated by the moonlight through the window. As Sarah approached the kitchen, she glanced at the wall clock and saw that it was exactly 1 a.m. On the kitchen floor, she found her mother lying in a pool of blood that covered the entire floor. Despite being in a state of shock, Sarah recognized the urgency of getting help as soon as possible. Next to her mother's hand, she saw the telephone receiver. She picked it up and dialed 911, but there was complete silence on the line. Sarah then rushed to Crystal's room, where the second phone was, and tried to call the police again, but this number also did not work. She dialed the numbers several times, then realized she had only one option left: seeking assistance from the neighbors. Sarah rushed out into the street in just her pajamas, barefoot. It was May, and the temperature was quite low. It had also been raining that night. But she didn't think about anything except helping her mother. The closest house was around half a mile down the road towards the city center. She reached it and began knocking on the door, but no one answered. Sarah then ran to other houses, but again, no one opened the door. She kept running towards the city center, knocking on several more doors, but still no one responded. Eventually, she reached an Italian restaurant where the owners lived in the attached building. This time, they finally opened the door. Sarah told them that someone had attacked her mother, and the shocked residents led her inside. Sarah called 911 herself and reported what had happened. The officers immediately headed to their house. The first thing they noticed was the amount of blood. It was literally everywhere, on the floor, walls, and practically on every kitchen item. Crystal was dead, and the medical experts could tell at a glance that she had almost no chance of survival, even if she had received help immediately after the attack. Given the severe blood loss, it would have been impossible to save her. On the front door glass, the police found a palm print, but quickly realized it likely belonged to Sarah. No other fingerprints were found at the crime scene, but there were numerous shoe prints on the kitchen floor, stained with blood. Investigators took photos to try to determine the size and model of the shoes, thinking they had most likely belonged to the killer. The prints also led towards Sarah's bedroom, but for some reason, the perpetrator turned back and didn't enter the room. Detectives also noticed a strange detail. Apparently, the killer tried to wipe away some of the blood from the floor. Considering that almost the entire kitchen was covered in it, along with Crystal herself, this seemed odd. It was obvious he couldn't have wiped away all the blood. Then detectives noticed that some blood drops on the floor were in different shapes. Most of them looked as if they had landed at an angle. According to investigators, they had likely flown off the knife the perpetrator used to attack the victim, but there were also other drops that had fallen on the floor at a right angle and, judging by the splatters, from a greater height. Detectives speculated that apparently the perpetrator had injured themselves during the murder, and this blood belonged to them. Another confirmation of this theory was the fact that these drops led to a roll of paper towels, and there were none left on the way out of the house. Most likely, the killer used these towels to stop the bleeding and immediately left the crime scene. Medical experts found over 50 stab wounds on Crystal's body. The murder weapon was not found in the house, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator took it with them. Experts only confirmed that it must have been a kitchen knife. The killer struck with such force that a piece broke off and lodged into the victim's body. Crystal had also been sexually assaulted, and experts were able to extract a sample of the perpetrator's semen along with the blood drops. It was sent to the lab. However, there was a problem. Due to funding shortages, the local laboratory was quite overloaded, so results would take at least 6 months. As a result, detectives had to begin the investigation without any evidence. First, they ruled out robbery, since nothing was missing from the house. There were no signs of forced entry either, leading police to speculate that the victim had opened the door to the perpetrator herself. She was in her pajamas, suggesting she was unlikely expecting guests. Investigators theorized that she either knew the killer or someone unfamiliar knocked on the door and convinced her to let them in under some pretext. The detective decided to start with the only witness, Sarah. They went to the hospital where she was being held for health checks and began questioning her. The police asked why she ran to the neighbors instead of calling 911 from home. Sarah replied that both their phones weren't working. But this answer seemed strange to the investigators when they arrived at the crime scene and were able to make calls without any problems. The detectives assumed that in such a stressful situation, Sarah could have simply gotten confused. The receiver of the first phone was off the hook, and to make a call, it needed to be placed back. As for the second phone, they didn't rule out that Sarah might have dialed the wrong number in haste, or the phone line might have temporarily gone out due to the rain. Then the police started asking her if she saw the killer. Sarah responded that she had not left her bedroom until it was all over, but the police treated her story with a bit of skepticism. They asked how she could know that her mother was attacked with a knife. Sarah replied that it was obvious, but the detectives continued to press her. They felt that she might be withholding some information and that she had actually seen the perpetrator. In the first 3 days after the murder, the police interrogated Sarah 18 times, hoping that her story would change. But she continued to insist that everything had happened as she told them. While pursuing other leads, detectives stumbled upon their first breakthrough. They found a pair of boots at a local shoe store, whose sole patterns matched the bloody footprints on the floor. They also discovered that Crystal had been harassed by Teresa, the girlfriend of her ex-husband. Despite the killer being obviously a man, the police decided to investigate her, considering that Teresa had repeatedly threatened the victim with murder. They could have found an accomplice and convinced him to commit the crime. However, detectives found no evidence to support this theory. Investigators then learned that at the time of her death, Crystal was seeing a man named Dennis. They had met 2 years prior when he started working in the shoe shop, and they began dating shortly after. Dennis eventually proposed to her, and although Crystal agreed, they never got married. Detectives found out that their relationship was quite tense. Crystal and Dennis argued a lot, and sometimes he displayed aggressive behavior, such as breaking things or hitting the wall. However, the police couldn't find any evidence that he had ever raised a hand on Crystal. The next day after the murder, they went to his house. When he opened the door, the investigators asked if he had left his house that night or seen Crystal. Dennis immediately asked if she was dead, and in the next second, he collapsed on the floor. After he regained consciousness, he began answering the detectives' questions. Dennis confirmed that he had planned to visit Crystal that evening, but got delayed after work, helping a friend fix a car. Upon returning home, he called Crystal, but she said it was too late, leading to an argument, and Dennis ended up staying home. While the police couldn't be 100% sure he was telling the truth, they were able to verify that he did help his friend that evening. Dennis also agreed to a polygraph test, and the operator didn't detect any signals of lying, except for one when he asked if he felt responsible for Crystal's death. Dennis answered no. Detectives also noticed that he had the same shoe size as the killer, but they found no matching footwear in Dennis's house. He agreed to provide a DNA sample, but made a strange request. He asked the detectives to come to his workplace through the back door to avoid disturbing others if they decided to arrest him. He explained that his boss had always treated him well, and he didn't want to disrupt the workflow. Considering that he continued to insist on his innocence, this request seemed suspicious. The police found out that Crystal's best friend, who lived in another town, had told them that just a few weeks before, Crystal had called her and said that she was scared of Dennis. Their arguments were becoming increasingly tense, and Dennis was growing more aggressive with each altercation. Crystal even thought about breaking up with him, but feared his reaction. During the conversation, she didn't provide any useful information, but as soon as the police left her workplace, Dennis came in and started asking what she had told the detectives. Despite their efforts, there was no evidence against the man, and the DNA test results would take months, so the police kept looking for other clues. They soon received a strange tip. A local man named Donnie got drunk at a party and started bragging about having killed Crystal. They took him in for questioning, but he claimed to have no memory of the party and denied any involvement in the murder. The investigators later discovered that Donnie was an alcoholic and a known liar. Another witness reported seeing a black pickup truck with New Hampshire plates near Crystal's house, But this lead didn't lead anywhere either. One woman told the police that on the night of the murder, she was driving past Sarah's house when she heard sirens and thought they were for her boyfriend, who lived down the road. At the same time, she saw a car with high beams on, following her at high speed. Thinking the driver was chasing her, she turned onto another road, but the car passed her by. However, the police couldn't confirm if this car was somehow related to the murder. Since then, the police struggled to find any solid leads. Crystal's relatives pulled together $10,000 as a reward for any information on the case, and they also distributed flyers around town, hoping to attract new witnesses. It's worth mentioning that Teresa, the girlfriend of Crystal's ex-husband, was seen tearing down these flyers multiple times. As for the ex-husband himself, he was thoroughly investigated, but detectives eventually doubted his involvement. Over the years, his alcohol problems became even worse, and now Tom drank heavily every day. In his condition, it seemed unlikely he could have committed such a crime, and he had no clear motive. The police also looked into 2 other men Crystal dated after divorcing her husband, but they found no evidence linking them to the case. All of them, including Tom, provided DNA samples, leaving detectives waiting for the lab results. 9 months after the murder, investigators finally received the results, which showed that the blood and semen samples didn't match any of the suspects, including Dennis. This left detectives with no other leads. They requested Dennis's sample again for additional testing, but the results remained the same. Stuck in a dead end, investigators decided to revisit their only witness, Sarah. They still assumed that either she was lying to them or her mind had blocked out the horrific memories of her mother's murder, and she actually saw the killer at that time. Sarah was living with her aunt in Texas, so the police headed to the other end of the country to question her. They polygraphed her, but the operator didn't detect any false answers. Despite this, investigators continued talking to her day after day, asking the same questions, but each time, she replied that she didn't see the killer. After that, the case remained unsolved for several years. The police kept interviewing people, checking various suspects, but it yielded no results. In the late 90s, when the FBI DNA database became available, investigators uploaded the sample of Crystal's killer, but no matches were found. In 1999, a new detective was assigned to the case. He decided not only to review all existing evidence, but also to collect DNA samples from as many men as possible living in the town and nearby areas. By then, the laboratory could conduct tests much faster, and the police obtained hundreds of samples, but none of them matched. The new detective also reached out to Sarah and persuaded her to work with a psychologist to try to recover suppressed memories. She agreed, but the psychologist concluded that Sarah truly didn't remember anything and was telling the truth about not seeing the perpetrator. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives kept working on it, but couldn't find any new leads. This continued until 2006, when something unexpected happened. Detectives received a message. A DNA sample was entered into the FBI database, and it matched with the blood and semen left by Crystal's killer. The owner of the DNA turned out to be a man named Michael Hutchinson, who had never been a suspect in the case. Detectives found out that in 2003, he was arrested for assault and threats with a weapon, resulting in a 6-month prison sentence and 3 years of probation. At the time, his DNA sample was taken, but for some reason, it wasn't uploaded to the FBI database and remained stored in the lab. 3 years later, Michael was arrested for drunk driving with his children in the car. He was released on bail, but he didn't show up for his court hearing, so he was sent to prison. Michael was also arrested right at his own wedding and placed in a cell. His DNA sample was taken again, and this time, it was immediately uploaded to the database. Soon after, investigators in Crystal's case received a match. The detective called Sarah and informed her about this, but asked her to keep the information secret until the official charges were filed. He also asked if she knew this person, and Sarah said no. Considering that Michael was already behind bars, The detective began slowly building the case to ensure that the suspect had no chance of escaping punishment. He found out that at the time of the murder, Michael lived in Bridgeton, just 2 miles from Crystal's house. Michael, who was 19 at the time, lived near the Italian restaurant where Sarah called the police. He drove to his mother's house almost every day, which was just a little further away than Crystal's house, so Michael regularly passed by it. For the detective, it meant that he could have seen Crystal multiple times. Eventually, he went to see Michael in prison, but the man claimed to have no connection to the murder and said he never knew the victim. Considering that his DNA was found on her body and his blood was found at the crime scene, the detective didn't rush to believe him. While in prison, the detective noticed something interesting. Michael had a large scar on his palm, and as we recall, Crystal's killer likely cut his hand during the murder. Although in court this could not be considered strong evidence, the presence of DNA was more than sufficient, so Michael was finally charged with murder. According to the prosecution, the man, a known user of illegal substances, had repeatedly seen Crystal as he passed by her house on that fateful night. He decided to assault her, and considering that he refused to confess, it was difficult to speculate on how exactly everything happened. But with the available evidence, the outcome was clear. Michael assaulted and killed her. During the trial, an explanation was also found for the fact that the killer managed to not leave a single fingerprint at the crime scene. The answer was quite unexpected. Michael worked as a bricklayer, and over time, people who have been engaged in this job begin to wear away the patterns on their palms, making it physically impossible for them to leave fingerprints on various surfaces. In his defense, Michael told his version of events. He said he met Crystal at a bar and they went back to her place, where they had consensual intercourse. At some point, an unknown man in a black motorcycle jacket burst into the house, knocked Michael out, and killed Crystal. When he regained consciousness, Michael tried to fight off the attacker, but the assailant injured him in the hand and fled. Michael himself also decided to leave the crime scene without any reasonable explanation. His story obviously seemed highly doubtful. The only shoe prints on the floor also belonged to him. If his story was true, the intruder would have had to take off his shoes before breaking into the house, and it still wouldn't have explained the absence of any other marks on the floor. Furthermore, there wasn't a single witness who saw Crystal at that bar. The trial ended on April 9, 2007, and Michael was unanimously found guilty. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole and remains in prison to this day. As for Sarah, her mother's murder undoubtedly had a critical impact on her. However, over the years, she found the strength to move forward. She attended college, became a writer, and published a book about her mother's murder, compiling all the available information. Moreover, when she was working on the book, Sarah managed to uncover new facts overlooked by the police. She discovered that during those years, Michael often borrowed his father's car, a black Ford pickup truck with New Hampshire license plates. As we recall, one witness reported seeing such a vehicle near Crystal's house. She also remembered the woman who told the police about the car with its high beams on, speeding past her on the night of the murder. At the time, the woman mentioned she mistook the ambulance sirens for police and thought they were heading to her boyfriend's house. That boyfriend was Michael. The police put his name in an address in the report, but back then, they decided there was no connection and didn't bother to investigate him further. Perhaps if the police had decided to speak with him, they would have noticed the cut on his hand, and the case would have been solved much sooner. The term femicide was first introduced in the mid-1970s, originally denoting crimes where men ended women's lives out of gender-based hatred. Over the years, however, the definition has evolved and varies across countries, depending on cultural context. In most places, it is classified as a severe crime against women, including assault, maiming, or causing death, perpetrated by men amid gender-based animosity. It's often said that women allow themselves to be mistreated. not reporting to police or leaving the men who caused them emotional and physical suffering, and sometimes even continuing to live with someone who might end their life at any moment. This claim is only partially true, as in some countries, the law inherently sides with men, giving them confidence that they will face no repercussions. The story of a young woman named Abel Perez is one of the most vivid examples of how femicide thrives among the affluent sectors of Mexican society. She and her husband, Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez, were wealthy and respected individuals, holding executive positions in major companies, and from the outside, their marriage seemed flawless. Yet this did not prevent the man from abusing his wife over the years and eventually having someone else violently end her life, also risking the lives of their children. To this day, this case remains unresolved, and all but the main perpetrator had been punished. Abel Perez, family and early years. Abel Sagaon. Perez was born on November 18, 1971, in Monterrey, in the northeastern part of Mexico, and was the second of 3 children to parents Maria del Socorro Sagaon and Manuel Perez. Raised alongside her older brother Javier and younger sister Ama, the family lived modestly, but her parents did everything possible to provide their children with a good education and motivate them to aspire to a better life. All the children excelled in school, engaged in music, sports, and other talents. Abel, in particular, showed a talent for mathematics and entrepreneurial skills from an early age. She was an avid reader and the top student in her class. As a teenager, Abel began working to achieve financial independence, was frugal, and always had savings. From her school days, she was very disciplined, able to plan and manage her time effectively. She dreamed of obtaining a high-quality higher education to secure a well-paying job with career advancement opportunities. After finishing high school, Abel was admitted to the most prestigious university in Nuevo León, where she earned a master's degree in finance and business administration. Her classmates described her as smart, incredibly focused and ambitious, but also cheerful, kind-hearted, and always ready to help others. Upon graduating, Perez was hired in the sales department of one of the country's largest and fastest-growing companies. A few years later, she ventured into digital sales, a new, booming field, and realized this was her calling. Quickly rising through the ranks, she became the executive director of the company within 2 years. Abel was young, beautiful, successful, ambitious, and steadily advancing towards the life she had always dreamed of. She built a brilliant career, supported her family, and was full of plans for the future. Yet her personal life remained unsettled, which disappointed her loved ones. Nevertheless, she was confident she would find true love and live a long, happy life. Little did Perez know how her marriage to the perfect man would turn out. Meeting Juan Carlos in the mid-1990s. As Abel's career was on the rise, fate brought her together with a young man named Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez. He was just 3 years her senior and equally ambitious career-wise, which greatly appealed to her. In return, he was captivated by her beauty, charm, kindness, and disarming smile, combined with a sharp intellect and remarkable determination. Sanchez was a graduate of a prestigious science and technology university, where he excelled in the economics and trade department. He later continued his education in the United States at Harvard University, after which he returned to Mexico and built a successful career in the relatively new field of e-commerce. The young professionals met at a conference dedicated to the latest financial technologies. They crossed paths several more times as their companies collaborated on joint projects, and eventually, Juan Carlos realized he had fallen in love with this intelligent beauty. Through mutual acquaintances, he obtained her phone number and decided to invite Perez out on a date. The feelings were mutual. She also found this educated, erudite man capable of holding a conversation on almost any topic, appealing and interesting. Their relationship developed quickly, and by 1998, the couple decided to formalize their relationship with a lavish wedding. By then, they had both achieved considerable career success and were involved in developing online stores, a very promising direction. Their life resembled a true fairy tale, evoking envy and admiration among their peers. Dark secrets of the perfect family. It wasn't until 2001, after 3 years of marriage, that the couple welcomed their long-awaited first child, a daughter they named Anna Cecilia. 30-year-old Abel was overjoyed, as the arrival of the child marked a new chapter in their lives. Her husband also seemed happy, treating their newborn daughter with tenderness and awe. 2 years later, Abel gave her beloved a son, whom they named after his father, Juan Carlos Jr. Another 2 years passed, and the family welcomed a third child, a boy named Julio Andreas. It's worth noting that the young mother hardly took any maternity leave and managed to brilliantly combine parental responsibilities with her career advancement. She prepared only homemade meals, helped the children with their schoolwork, took them to sports activities, and strived to be not just an ideal mother, but also their best friend. From the outside, the Perez Sanchez family appeared perfect in every way. Wealthy, successful, raising 3 wonderful children, having everything one could wish for, and seeming very happy. But appearances can be deceiving. What happened inside their home remained unknown even to the couple's closest relatives for a long time. In reality, Juan Carlos showed his true nature in the first years of their life together. He was hot-tempered, aggressive, and rather harsh, intolerant of compromise, insisting that everything had to be exactly as he wanted. But Abel was in love, and initially thought that over time they would rub along and his character would soften. Moreover, their joint projects united them. They worked towards a common goal, and their teamwork yielded impressive results, including financially. However, over time, he became more irritable, and verbal altercations escalated into physical confrontations. After the birth of their first daughter, the husband briefly softened, trying to keep his emotions in check. But it didn't last long. The same happened after the birth of their eldest son, but by the time the third child was born, he no longer even tried to be a good father or husband. Juan Carlos vented his anger, negative emotions, or just bad mood on his wife, sparing no feelings. He insulted and belittled the mother of his children, and her tears seemed to lift his spirits. He then began to regularly physically harm his wife, often doing so in a way that left no visible marks on exposed parts of her body, so she could hide the bruises under clothing or mask them with makeup. All this was done with one simple purpose: to protect his flawless reputation and pride himself on being considered a model family man, loving husband, and father. Abel kept silent for years, trying not to tell even her sister and mother about the ongoing nightmare. She earned well and could have raised the children on her own, providing them with a good education and a stable upbringing. But her husband was a wealthy and very influential man, and he could easily take the children away from her through the courts. Knowing what Juan Carlos was really like, Perez could not bear the thought of her daughter and sons being left alone with a real monster, capable of anything, starting over with old problems. 2010 approached. The situation within the family escalated to its limit, to the extent that those who once considered this household ideal began to suspect something terrible was happening within. Abel was not just subdued, but deeply distressed, visibly thinner, sleeping poorly, and frequently had bruises on her face and body that became increasingly difficult to conceal and impossible for her to explain. Juan Carlos maintained a calm and confident demeanor, pretending that nothing was wrong. In public, he continued to play the role of a loving and caring husband, interacting with his wife politely and affectionately, but at home, he transformed into a monster, making it increasingly dangerous to be near him. Despite pleas from loved ones to divorce, Abel stubbornly insisted that everything was fine and that she would handle the problems with her husband herself. 2014 marked the peak of Sanchez's career when he became the head of a major trading company and one of the most influential people in the field. After this promotion, the family moved to Mexico City and settled in a large house in one of the capital's best neighborhoods. Their children attended an elite private school, and a beleaguered Perez sincerely hoped that the move and complete change of scenery would positively affect their relationship. Contrary to expectations, it changed. The man continued to physically harm and insult his wife, increasingly doing so in front of their children. Furthermore, Juan Carlos began to groundlessly accuse his wife of infidelity. And whenever she tried to defend herself, he resorted to using his fists, claiming he would find evidence of her disloyalty. He monitored her phone and emails, forbade her from using social media, and later, finding no evidence, even hired a private detective to follow Abel and photograph any men who came near her. 2 attempts on her life. For another 4 years, the woman tried everything to save her marriage, though her husband's behavior became utterly unbearable. She lived in a never-ending nightmare that outwardly seemed like a happy and successful union. Many even envied Abel, as she had such a prominent, influential, wealthy, and as many thought, caring husband. In 2018, the Sanchez family traveled to Monterrey to celebrate Catholic Christmas with the Perez family. However, Juan Carlos behaved toward his wife as he was accustomed, not shying away from her parents, who were horrified by what they witnessed. At that moment, the woman realized things could not continue this way and informed her husband that she would file for divorce once they returned to Mexico City. Hearing this, in a fit of rage, he grabbed her throat and squeezed so tightly she nearly lost consciousness. Only her mother, Maria del Socorro, entering the room and raising the alarm, prevented a tragedy. When the family returned to their home in the capital, Abel, preparing for divorce, moved from the marital bedroom to a small guest room, but this did not save her from the tyrant. On the morning of January 4th, while she was still asleep, her husband entered the bedroom holding a baseball bat. He struck her hard on the head and was about to swing again. Half awake, Perez barely understood what was happening, but managed to slip off the bed just in time, literally saving her own life. The woman began to scream, and the children ran into the room, having heard the noise. The youngest son shielded his mother with his body, while the eldest son took the bat from his father. Together with their mother, they fled the house and headed to the hospital as Abel needed medical attention. Doctors diagnosed her with a serious concussion and a deep laceration above her eyebrow, which required stitches. Marital conflict. As soon as his wife and sons left the home, Juan Carlos contacted his lawyer to explain the situation and asked for help in resolving it. He also posted on his social media page, claiming that his wife had betrayed him, was unfaithful, and intended to leave him for another man, taking their children and attempting to take all their jointly acquired assets. Moreover, he claimed that his wife had stolen all the money from their home safe and that when he tried to stop her, she injured him with a knife in the shoulder. As proof, he posted photos of a bloodied knife and brown stains on the floor. However, the blood on the floor was actually Abel's from her own room, and the knife photo was taken from the internet. Nonetheless, Sanchez's friends believed his story and began actively sharing and reposting his account on their personal social media pages, calling for widespread attention to this egregious case. While still in the hospital, Perez filed a police report against her husband, accusing him of attempting to end her life. After being discharged, she moved out of their home, taking her sons with her, over whom she was granted temporary sole custody. Their eldest daughter, by then an adult who had finished school and moved to another city for college, also sided with her mother, condemning her father's cruel and unacceptable behavior. Sanchez was ordered to pay alimony to his ex-wife and sons while they stayed with their mother, although the amount was quite small, about $300, which he disagreed with. He himself faced a potential prison sentence, but the influential businessman was confident he would remain free and avoid any punishment. After enduring such a nightmare, Abel decided to return to her native Monterrey, to her parents' home, taking her children with her. It was there that she filed for divorce, and from there she monitored the situation. Meanwhile, she began offering help and online consultations to women in similar situations, and she planned to open a center for psychological and legal assistance for victims of domestic violence. Corrupt justice system. Only in September 2019, 8.5 months after the incident, was Sanchez finally arrested on charges of femicide, inflicting bodily harm and attempting to end his wife's life. He was placed in jail, where he spent over a month, but by November of that year, He managed to appeal the pre-trial detention decision and was released. The case was presided over by Judge Federico Mas, who unexpectedly reclassified it, leading to a new trial. During the trial, photographs of Perez from the hospital and entries from her medical records were not presented, and the testimonies of the woman and her sons were deemed insufficient grounds for detaining Juan Carlos. Furthermore, the defendant insisted that his ex-wife was turning the children against him. The defendant was released directly from the courtroom, as Judge Mas considered that his actions did not pose a direct threat to the victim's life. According to the judge, if Sanchez had truly intended to end his wife's life, he would have followed through, especially since she was asleep during the attack and unable to resist. Abel was shocked and frightened by this turn of events. She realized that her ex-husband had utilized all his connections and paid off the right people to be set free, putting her and her children in danger. She sent an official letter to the judge expressing fear for her life, but it had no impact on the situation. Immediately after being released, Juan Carlos began legal proceedings against his ex-wife for custody of their sons. He forced her and the children to return to Mexico City to attend court sessions. Otherwise, the matter could be resolved in absentia, not in her favor, so she was compelled to return to the capital. Tragedy. Witnessed by children. On November 25th, Abel arrived in Mexico City with her children. She genuinely feared the man she had lived with for over 20 years and did not want to encounter him unnecessarily. She planned to leave the city the same day after the hearing and had already purchased plane tickets, which Juan Carlos knew about. Ironically, on that day, a mass demonstration against gender-based violence was taking place in the capital. Immediately after the court session, the woman, along with her sons and their lawyer, got into a car heading to the airport, but they never reached their destination. At a traffic light, a motorcyclist pulled up next to their car, unexpectedly drew a handgun, and fired twice at Perez, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, before swiftly fleeing the scene. One of the bullets passed through and grazed the younger son, who was sitting in the back seat, but fortunately, none of the children were seriously hurt. The injured woman was quickly taken to the nearest hospital, where doctors fought desperately for over 6 hours to save her life. Unfortunately, due to severe injuries and significant blood loss, they were unable to save 48-year-old Abel, who passed away that evening. The victim's parents, brother, and sister flew to the capital immediately and urged authorities to arrest Juan Carlos, convinced that he was behind this brutal act that occurred in front of the children. However, law enforcement had a different view, stating that without identifying the shooter, it was difficult to discuss his motives, and it could not be definitively claimed that it was a hitman sent by Sanchez. The case was not classified as femicide until further investigation. Predictably, Juan Carlos remained free, and the police began searching for the shooter, which could take an extended period. The orphaned children were temporarily placed under the care of their maternal relatives, while their father prepared to fight for them in court again. Abel's sister wrote an angry post on her social media account openly blaming Sanchez for the incident, but her page was soon blocked and later deleted. Nonetheless, the family decided to fight and draw heightened public attention to the case, highlighting that the attack on Perez happened on the day dedicated to fighting gender-based violence, public outcry, and the flight of the main suspect. The victim's relatives managed to draw attention to the tragedy that struck their family. Moreover, people openly discussed numerous cases where men attempted to end women's lives, but did not follow through and remained free without facing any punishment. Due to the significant public outcry, the General Prosecutor's Office of Mexico initiated a new investigation concerning Sanchez and was also instructed to check the legality of the actions of the judges who had released him. The judges handling Juan Carlos's case were temporarily suspended from work and later removed from their positions. Mexican politician and women's rights defender Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo officially confirmed that the Perez case had been reclassified as femicide and would be reinvestigated, and the judges who had released Juan Carlos could face consequences for the woman's death if his guilt was proven. The businessman regularly posted on social media, calling for the perpetrator of his former wife to be found and punished to the fullest extent of the law. He also noted that despite the disagreements between him and Abel, he would never dare harm the mother of his children, let alone end her life in front of their sons. However, his daughter Anna Cecilia left an angry comment under one of these posts, accusing her father of cruelty and accompanying her words with photos of her mother taken in the hospital after Juan Carlos had attacked her with a bat. Despite the resonance and widespread media coverage of the case, it was decided to leave Sanchez free during the investigation. He was placed under a restraining order and required to check in weekly at a police station, but after he failed to appear at the appointed time, a warrant for his arrest was issued for violating the order. As one might guess, no one could find the accused. It turned out that the businessman again used his money and connections to quickly leave the country and enter the United States. Mexican authorities contacted Interpol, reporting the fugitive accused of a serious crime, and the next day, Sanchez was declared wanted almost worldwide. Arrest of hired criminals and reconstruction of the crime scene. During this time, efforts were underway to locate the hired criminal who, it turned out, did not work alone. Surveillance footage from street cameras clearly showed two vehicles following the car from the courthouse in which Abel, her children, and their lawyer were traveling. The motorcyclist, who later emerged and performed the legal act, appeared to be in constant communication with the individuals in the aforementioned cars, receiving directions and instructions. It took investigators several months to identify just some of the participants of the incident, and it wasn't until March 5, 2020, that two suspects were arrested in connection to the case. Surprisingly, they did not resist arrest and almost immediately started giving testimonies, hoping to mitigate their sentences. It was confirmed that the orchestrator of the crime was indeed Juan Carlos, who had paid a substantial amount, with 7 people directly involved in carrying out the act. The first to be apprehended were the driver of one of the chase cars and the motorcyclist who fired the fatal shots. It emerged that, while in prison, Juan Carlos had hired a couple of seasoned criminals to protect him, acting as his personal bodyguards. One of these criminals was released a week before Sanchez, and the other was freed several days after him. Once out of prison, the businessman reconnected with them, asking them to find reliable people to carry out the elimination of a person, promising a substantial sum of money to each if successful. When all participants were identified, the orchestrator transferred the promised money and provided precise instructions about the route and vehicle Abel would be using. The most challenging part of the plan turned out to be luring his former wife to Mexico City. The man resorted to blackmail, threatening to take the children if she did not appear in court. Although she complied with the court appearance, she had no intention of staying in the capital, planning to return to Monterrey the same day, and Juan Carlos knew this from his sources. Despite this information, it wasn't until the end of October 2020 that 3 more participants in the criminal conspiracy were apprehended. Moreover, the arrest of these criminals was initially on suspicion of distributing controlled substances, and it was only at the police station that it was discovered these individuals could be involved in the high-profile crime. All arrested were part of a major drug trafficker, Juan Carlos Maldonado's gang, known as Juan Balto. He had served time with Sanchez and provided him protection, later agreeing to assist in eliminating his former wife for a hefty reward. Maldonado was arrested a couple of weeks later in November 2020. He began giving testimonies, confirming that the businessman had sought reliable individuals to end his ex-wife's life, and he agreed to help him in return for a substantial reward. There was no doubt left that Sanchez was both the client and organizer of the crime, and his previous assault on Abel with a bat was officially reclassified as an attempt on her life, leaving the court to finally issue an arrest warrant for him on charges of femicide. However, the man's whereabouts remained unknown. By spring 2021, the remaining participants in the commissioned perpetration of Perez were found and arrested. Notably, one of them was already serving a sentence for another crime at the time. Also, during extensive searches, the weapon used to make the fatal shots was found. In total, 9 people associated with the same criminal group were detained, 7 of whom were directly involved in chasing and shooting Abel. Almost 5 years after the woman's death, the main culprit and client of the crime, Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez, remains at large, with his whereabouts still undetermined. The individual who pulled the trigger, ending the life of a mother of 3, was sentenced to 52 years in prison. 2 other criminals who chased the car and coordinated the shooter's actions were also sentenced to 50 years each. The other arrested participants of the incident are still under investigation, and their fate has yet to be decided. In 2012, at the Summer Olympics in London, the star of a young Puerto Rican boxer, Felix Verdejo Sanchez, shone brightly. He was called a diamond, one of the most promising athletes of his country. He was predicted to win titles and gold medals. Then it seemed to everyone that this talented and motivated young man will reach fantastic heights in sports. In 2021, the name of the boxer again traveled all the world's media, but this time fell into the section of criminal chronicles. This story is about a teenage attachment that grew into a kind of addiction and led to a terrible tragedy, and also about how the author of the main knockout of 2014, who was praised and promoted by 2-time Olympic champion Vasyl Lomachenko, almost received a death sentence, but eventually went to prison for life. It is noteworthy that despite the presence of irrefutable evidence and confessions of the boxer's accomplice, he himself to this day refuses to plead guilty. The future star of world boxing was born in the Puerto Rican city of San Juan in 1993 on May 19th. He grew up in a rather modest large family and from an early age was fond of port. True, in childhood, he planned to connect his life with baseball, but his further fate was determined by a funny incident. When the boy was 9 years old, a family friend came to visit them with his son of the same age. The boys were playing in the yard, but suddenly quarreled, and a fight broke out. Parents separated the children, and the father of the future athlete noted that if he wants to fight with someone in the future, let him wear boxing gloves. After that fight, Felix, at his request, was taken to a local gym, where the boy, as he later admitted himself, from the first training session fell in love with boxing. At the age of 16, he won the Pan American Junior Championships. A year later, he won his country's championship, and a year later, he went to the Olympic Games in London, where he reached the quarterfinals. In the same year began his brilliant career in the professional ring. In total, Verdejo had 29 fights, gaining 27 confident victories, and in 2014 he was recognized as the author of the best knockout in the fight against Sergio Villanueva. A year later, Felix won his first championship belt with the WBO Latino title, which he subsequently defended 6 more times in 2 years. Everyone who saw him in the fight had no doubt, this young man will write his name in the history of world boxing. And now let's get to know Keishla Rodriguez. The girl was born in November 1993 in San Juan. The full name given to her at birth is Keishla Marlene Rodriguez Ortiz. Her parents, Jose and Kayla Rodriguez, had another common daughter, Bereliz Nicole, and also the couple raised Kayla's son, Jonathan, from a previous marriage of a woman. Keishla grew up an open and sociable girl. She did well in school and adored animals, dreaming of becoming a veterinarian in the future. Her best friend was her sister Bereliz, to whom she confided all her secrets and worries. Keishla studied in the same school with Felix Verdejo, who was her age. Young people were acquainted since childhood, and in adolescence between them began a romantic relationship. In 2011, Rodriguez's parents divorced and separated. Kayla moved to relatives in Florida, and her daughters, who were by then already adults, decided to stay in San Juan. Despite the fact that each of the sisters had long since lived their own lives, they continued to stay in close contact and told each other about everything that was happening to them. At the age of 18, a promising boxer, who was already managed to take part in the Olympic Games, had an affair with a young schoolgirl and aspiring model, Elisa Maria Santiago Sierra. At that time, the girl was only 14 years old, and she was still in school, but even then she made big plans for the future with a promising and world-famous athlete. In addition, Elisa's parents were not at all against this relationship. Attractive and talented Felix, who has always had a lot of fans, becoming a boxing star, literally bathed in the rays of fame and was surrounded by female attention. He did not miss the opportunity to spin a novel or a passing affair on the side, and also, despite the serious relationship with Eliza, continued to meet with his school friend Keishla. Keishla's sister, Bereliz, and her mother, Kayla Rodriguez, knew about the affair and did not approve of the relationship. In addition, the situation was very ambiguous. On the one hand, Eliza considered herself the only woman and great love of the athlete, was preparing for the wedding, and made far-reaching plans for their joint future. On the other hand, Kishla knew that the lover has a fiancé, but at the same time, Felix did not let her go. On top of that, he was her first great love, and deep down, the naive girl herself still hoped to be the one. In 2016, the boxer did marry the young Eliza, who at that time was barely 19 years old. Eliza by that time was already quite a famous model, had tens of thousands of followers in social networks, and also opened her own beauty studio for eyelash extensions. In August of the same year, just a few months after the wedding, the athlete got into a serious car accident when he was rushing on his motorcycle. He was taken to the hospital in serious condition with head injuries, bruises, and lacerations. His trainer, Ricky Marquez, seriously feared that his talented charge would go off the rails at the height of his career. But Felix, contrary to the disappointing prognosis, made a rapid recovery and soon returned to the ring. In September 2019, the boxer published in his profile in the social network a picture with Elise, who was in a large term of pregnancy. In the comment to the photo, he wrote, "Soon I will meet my daddy's princess." And a month later, he announced the birth of a daughter, who was given the name Miranda Verdejo Santiago. The young man in public looked like a loving husband, caring father, and an exemplary family man. But secretly from his wife, he continued to meet with Kishla, who could not let go. As Eliza later admitted, she guessed that her husband was cheating on her, but every time he tearfully vowed to leave his mistress. Kishla repeatedly tried to break off this painful relationship, but Felix would not let her go. She had no other men, because the boxer threatened that if he found out about the fact that Kishla had someone, not good for her and her chosen one, Kishla herself, who had fallen in love with Verdejo since high school, continued to love him despite everything. Rodriguez, as planned, connected her life with the care of animals and got a job at the Center of Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics. Colleagues described her as conscientious, hard-working, and very responsible. She lived with 2 dogs and a cat, which she simply adored. In 2020, Eliza discovered the correspondence of her husband with several mistresses, including Kishla. The wife gave her husband a scandal and threw him out of the house, threatening that she would file for divorce and forbid him to see his daughter. Eliza's threats had an effect. In addition, in the career of the athlete at that time, there was a serious decline and unnecessary problems where he did not need. For a while, he really stopped seeing Rodriguez, but Felix still did not let her go, trying to control almost every step Kishla. After a few months of secret visits resumed, and in April 2021, Kishla discovered that she was pregnant. She bought a rapid test at the drugstore, which only confirmed her fears. She first called her sister, who was aware of her complicated relationship with the athlete, and told her everything. It was out of the question to have an abortion, because Kishla was already 27 years old, and she was ready to have a child, even if she had to raise it on her own. A few days later, Kishla broke the news to the father of her child, hoping in her heart that he would accept it, but Felix was not happy, to put it mildly. He got angry and told his mistress that she should go to the doctor, and if the pregnancy is confirmed, it will be necessary to have an abortion. Naturally, Rodriguez answered him with a firm refusal, but the boxer began to threaten her and insist. Felix said that an illegitimate child will finally destroy his reputation, and this he cannot allow. After Kishla's visit to the hospital, her pregnancy was confirmed, and she now had a certificate to prove it. She called Felix and told him everything, which made him furious. Felix shouted and demanded that Kishla immediately get rid of the child, but she again responded with a categorical refusal. Then the athlete decided to go on the sly, saying that he did not believe her and wanted to personally look at the issued medical certificate. He appointed Kishla a meeting in the evening in a crowded place, which did not surprise her, because they always tried not to draw attention to themselves and did not get in front of anyone. A few days before the meeting, the boxer stopped by his old friend Luis Antonio Perez, who worked in a local machine shop and also had ties with the criminal world, selling illegal drugs. Felix briefly outlined the situation and asked him to help him get rid of his pregnant mistress. Luis had previously been in the field of vision of the police, and the prospect of being in prison scared him. But the athlete was persistent, assured that everything would go smoothly and the police will never come out on them. Besides, Felix promised him an impressive cash reward, and Luis agreed, with the support of an accomplice. Felix called Kishla and told her that he wanted to meet her on the evening of April 29th to confirm her pregnancy and decide what to do next. Immediately after talking to her lover, Kishla called her sister back and told her everything. She still had hope that Felix would accept her child and would not insist on an abortion. But Berylise all this situation is quite alarmed. She knew that the boyfriend had threatened her sister, and she was worried that he wouldn't do anything to her. Berylise called her mother and shared her concerns, but even together they could not dissuade Kishla from that fateful meeting. At the appointed time, Rodriguez, taking a doctor's note, arrived at the meeting in her own Kia Forte automobile. Verdejo drove there in his pickup truck, in the back of which Luis was hiding. Kishla immediately got into the athlete's car and showed him the results of the tests. He once again talked about terminating the pregnancy, but Kishla, crying, again responded with a refusal. Against this background, the couple began to quarrel violently, turning to shouting. Then Felix suddenly hit Kishla in the head with his fist, from which she immediately lost consciousness. Until Kishla regained consciousness, Felix took a syringe with a large dose of illegal substances hidden in the glove compartment of the car, which Luis had obtained at his request, and injected Kishla. Then, together with his accomplice, they carried her to the back of the car, where there were already prepared pieces of wire and a concrete block. The men tied Rodriguez up, attached the load, and then covered her with a tarp so that no one would accidentally see anything. Felix then returned to the pickup truck while his accomplice got behind the wheel of Kishla's vehicle. Together, they drove to the bridge over the San Jose Lagoon. It was virtually deserted at night, and the men, making sure no one could see them, threw Kishla, still alive, into the water. Afterward, however, they decided to fire a few test shots in pursuit, using the firearms they had brought with them so as not to leave the victim any chance. Having finished the massacre, each of the perpetrators went home. Kishla's co-workers were the first to worry when she didn't show up at the Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics Center the next day. Kishla has always been very responsible and couldn't just not show up for work without notifying anyone. Since she didn't answer the phone, it was decided to contact her sister to find out what happened. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact her sister, she went to her house. No one answered the door, but Berylise had a spare key, so she got in without difficulty. However, she was met only by hungry animals who had not eaten anything for almost 24 hours. Now Berylise was already in a panic because she realized that something terrible or irreparable had happened to Kishla. She immediately called her mother and told her everything, and then reported to the police about her suspicions and threats to her sister. She also called Felix, but he claimed that he had spent the previous evening and night at home with his family and had not gone to any meeting. The missing girl's mother took the first flight from Florida to San Juan. She thought that her lover might have taken her daughter to a private clinic and paid for her to have an abortion without her consent. Kayla didn't even want to think about the fact that Kishla was no longer alive. The first thing to do was to question the missing girl's neighbors and co-workers, but they didn't notice anything suspicious and couldn't provide the investigation with any useful information. In parallel, messages about the disappearance of Rodriguez were posted on popular social networks with requests to respond to those who know anything about her fate or current whereabouts. The case quickly received wide publicity, and when it became known that the missing girl was in a long-term relationship with a famous athlete and was expecting a child from him, reporters literally lined up to interview any of Rodriguez's family members. The relatives did not hold anything back and spoke out about their suspicions, among other things, blaming Felix for the incident. On April 30th, Kishla's car was found abandoned on the east side of the city, with her documents and personal belongings inside. No signs of struggle were found in the interior, giving a faint hope of finding its owner alive. On May 1st, a passerby strolling on the bridge over the lagoon saw a strange shape resembling a human body in the shallow water. He reported his discovery to the police, who soon recovered from the water the body of a young woman presumably the same one the whole city had been looking for several days. Members of the Rodriguez family, who arrived to identify the body, hoped to the last that it was not Keishla, but their hopes were not realized. The body had been in the water for several days and changed a lot. But the girl was immediately identified by a remarkable tattoo on her arm. When news of the gruesome discovery hit the press, the residents of the city revolted and began to go out to spontaneous rallies, demanding punishment for those responsible. The same day, Verdejo was detained and taken to the police station for questioning, but the athlete categorically denied his involvement and claimed that on the night of Keishla's disappearance, he was at home with his family. As there was nothing to charge him, Felix was released on his own recognizance. One of the key witnesses was the athlete's legal wife, who at the first interrogation admitted that she was aware of his affair with Keishla, but that she had heard about her rival's pregnancy for the first time. On top of that, she did not confirm her husband's alibi, saying that he was not at home on the night of the murder. The first thing investigators did was check traffic surveillance footage on the way to the bridge from which Keishla was thrown. That's how they found Felix's pickup truck and the victim's car traveling behind each other. But the Kia Forte was clearly not driven by its owner. On the same day, the boxer's car was seized for examination, and in its body they found some hair of the deceased. Luis was the first to surrender to the police, promising to tell the whole truth in exchange for a reduced sentence. Felix was also taken into custody, but he refused to cooperate with the investigation, did not answer questions, and continued to deny his guilt, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence. A firearm was seized from Felix, which he used to shoot the victim from the bridge, and for which he had an official permit. Also, a cell phone check confirmed the fact that Felix, Luis, and Keishla were in the same location on that fateful night. Keishla's final farewell was on May 8th, and the funeral ceremony was all over the national news. It was a kind of action, calling for the perpetrators of the tragedy to be punished to the full extent of the law, as well as an action to draw public attention to the problem of gender violence. The coffin with Rodriguez's body was brought to the cemetery not in a traditional hearse, but in a white carriage, over which white flower petals were thrown from the air. Many famous Puerto Rican natives, including show business stars, athletes, politicians, and public figures, have spoken out about the high-profile incident. Verdejo was charged with carjacking, kidnapping, premeditated murder, and the murder of an unborn child. All of these crimes together carried the death penalty, but the relatives of the deceased from the very beginning asked the court to elect a sentence of life imprisonment for the killer, so that he would suffer in captivity for the rest of his life. The hearing was repeatedly postponed due to the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, but in the spring of 2021, the trial was held in virtual mode. The court found that the crime was committed by a group of persons by prior conspiracy, and with particular cruelty against a pregnant woman. It was possible to reconstruct the chain of events of that night and the details of the crime, mainly thanks to the testimony of Luis, who did not deny his guilt. He admitted that it was he who, at the request of a friend, got the drug for injection and also brought a wire and a concrete block to get rid of the body. But Felix continued to insist on his non-involvement in the case, although his words could not seriously affect the situation. By the way, the wife of the boxer, who acted in court as a witness, almost immediately after the arrest of her husband filed for divorce and tried to abstract from what was happening, focusing on the development of his business and raising a young daughter. According to some reports, not so long ago, Elisa Santiago remarried. Elisa herself admitted in an interview that she repeatedly received anonymous calls and messages with death threats, as well as death wishes to her and even Miranda. Many considered it was the spouse of the athlete as the organizer of the crime, but no evidence was found. In the summer of 2023, it became known that the jury, having familiarized itself with all the evidence and heard the testimony of all the witnesses, was finally ready to announce the final verdict. Felix Verdejo and his accomplice Luis Cadiz were found guilty on each of the charges against them. But despite this, the killers have not yet been sentenced. The next court hearing is scheduled for mid-November 2023. Most likely, both men involved in the deaths of Keishla Rodriguez and her unborn child will likely go to prison for life, with no right to ever leave prison. when a friend turns into a ruthless criminal. You've probably heard the saying, "With friends like these, who needs enemies?" This is often said about those who only pretend to be good friends, but are ready to betray, set up, deceive, and even commit a crime against you at any moment. Such vile actions often hide some selfish motive, but their consequences can be utterly unpredictable, and the bitter disappointment in a close person who betrayed your trust is usually the least of the evils. The case of Sarah Stern shocked even veteran police officers with the cynicism and cold-bloodedness with which her closest friend, whom she had known since childhood and trusted implicitly, dealt with the unfortunate young woman. It was this friend with whom the student shared her future plans and a significant secret that no one else knew. By doing so, Sarah essentially signed her own death warrant, as from that moment until the tragic end, the young man lived with plans on how to make her disappear forever, while remaining above suspicion. Surprisingly, this crime could have been prevented if those around had taken the perpetrator's words and actions more seriously. The criminal even laid out his plan on paper, presenting it as a script for a horror movie. But let's dissect this complex story from the beginning to understand what drove such a good friend. Who was Sarah Stern? Sarah Elizabeth Stern was born on March 24, 1997, in the small town of Neptune City in Monmouth County, New Jersey. She was the only and dearly beloved child in the simple family of Michael and Susan Stern. Due to health issues, Mrs. Stern couldn't have more children, so the parents poured all their love into their long-awaited daughter. Sarah grew up as an active, cheerful, and very sociable child. She performed on the school theater stage, was passionate about photography, drew well, and was involved in sports, competing for the local swimming team and playing softball. She dreamed of becoming an artist or designer and was preparing to apply to a local specialized college when a terrible tragedy struck her family. In the autumn of 2013, when 16-year-old Sarah had just graduated from high school and started college in the field of art she had dreamed of, her mother passed away. The woman had fought a long battle with cancer, and it seemed several times that the disease had receded, but the insidious illness returned with new force and ultimately won. This loss was a huge shock for the entire family, especially for the young girl who was always very close to her mother. For a while, Stern fell into depression, but she tried to support her father with whom she lived, and who also had a hard time. They also lived with a dog named Buddy, whom the girl adored. Gradually, life began to improve. Sarah made plans for the future, and after graduating from college, she wanted to apply to a prestigious national university in New York. But before that, she dreamed of traveling the world, particularly planning to visit Canada, and perhaps even live there for some time. The abandoned car. Michael Stern often had to travel out of state for work, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. But he never worried about leaving his daughter home alone because she was a grown, independent young woman, and their town was considered quiet and safe. However, in December 2016, when he flew out for another business trip, trouble came knocking at his door. On the night of December 3, 2016, around 2:30 a.m., a call came into the police station from a concerned man reporting a car abandoned in the middle of the Belmar Bridge along Highway 35. The area was quite deserted, rarely traversed by anyone at night, making the solitary, empty vehicle immediately suspicious. The caller was a taxi driver, taking a shortcut home over the old bridge on the outskirts. He noticed the car parked by the side and stopped to see if anyone needed help. Finding the cabin empty and no one around, he called the police, suspecting the driver might have come here to end their life by jumping into the water below, a sadly not uncommon occurrence at this spot. Responding officers noted the keys left in the admission. There were no signs of blood in the car, nor any signs of a struggle, leading to the initial theory that someone came to the bridge with the intention of voluntarily leaving this world by jumping into the river below. The next step was to find out who owned the abandoned old silver sedan. A database check revealed the car belonged to one Lily Stern, a senior American citizen who recently celebrated her 85th birthday. She lived in the same town, about 10 kilometers from where her car was found. Officers promptly visited Miss Stern's home to understand how and why the elderly woman's car ended up on the bridge at night. Lily was found at home, alive well, and surprised by the police visit. She explained that due to poor eyesight, she hadn't driven for years. Instead, her 19-year-old granddaughter, Sarah, was the one who drove the car. Concerned, Lily immediately tried to call Sarah, but her phone was turned off. She then gave the officers her son's address, where he lived with Sarah, noting that only Sarah should be home since her father was away on a work trip and wouldn't be back until the next week. The mysteriously disappeared student. Sarah was not at home, and the back door to the house was found open, a worrying sign. An initial sweep by the police inside revealed nothing suspicious except for a dog whining locked in one of the bedrooms. There was no indication of any crime taking place. Belongings were in order, and there were no signs of struggle, bloodstains, or any evidence of an intruder's presence. By then, news of the situation had reached Michael Stern, and he was on his way home on the first available flight. The homeowner confirmed everything was in its place, and nothing was missing. Moreover, he stated that all of Sarah's personal belongings were also at home, including her passport, driver's license, and even her mobile phone, which she never parted with. The police shared their initial thoughts with Michael, suggesting his daughter might have gone to the bridge with the intention of jumping, and asked if he had noticed any signs of suicidal tendencies or self-harm attempts. Michael admitted that after his wife's passing, Sarah had gone through a period of depression, but with the support of family, friends, and her studies, she managed to recover. Furthermore, she had big plans for the future, dreaming of becoming a designer, wanting to travel and see the world. Nonetheless, on the night of December 3rd, the student vanished from her own home, and a few hours later, her car was found abandoned on the bridge. These were the established facts. Sarah was officially missing, and the investigation had to figure out who she was in contact with that day, what conversations she had, and who saw her last. Testimonies from the first witnesses. It soon came to light that on December 2nd, Sarah Stern had spent nearly the entire day with her best friend, Liam McAtasney, whom she had known since childhood. Liam turned out to be the last person who saw her, potentially shedding light on this mysterious case. Thus, law enforcement quickly decided to speak with him to gather details and try to reconstruct the events of that day. Upon arriving at the McAtasney residence, police were met by Liam's mother, who informed them that her son was sleeping off a night shift. At the officer's request, she woke him up. Seemingly confused about the situation, Liam was surprised to learn about Sarah's disappearance. He confirmed that they had spent most of the previous day together and agreed to go to the police station to provide his statement. Liam shared that they had gone to college together in the morning, but decided to skip the last 2 lectures since it was Friday, and they wanted to relax. After class, they went back to her place, played video games, chatted, and shared their future plans. They left the house twice that day, once to grab food from a nearby fast food restaurant, and another time to stop by a local supermarket. Around 7 in the evening, he left Sarah's house to head to his night shift at a 24-hour store and didn't see her after that. When asked if Sarah had been experiencing any psychological issues or other difficulties, Liam revealed quite a bit. He said that Sarah had been deeply depressed since her mother's passing, teetering between wanting to end it all or run away and start anew. He also mentioned that Sarah had had issues communicating with her father, struggling to find common ground. Liam didn't dismiss the possibility that Sarah might have taken her own life, but noted that shortly before disappearing, she had seriously considered moving to Canada and had even exchanged some money. His claim was confirmed by finding Canadian dollars in the bedside table drawer in Sarah's room, though the amount was so small it wouldn't have covered much. Another close friend and former classmate of Stern's, Preston Taylor, who had been her date to the high school prom and kept in touch after graduation, also gave a statement. He corroborated Liam's account, adding that Sarah was depressed and speculated that she either ran away to Canada or jumped off the bridge. By the end of the conversation, he was in tears, expressing how much Sarah meant to him. Search for the body, questioning other witnesses. The theory of Sarah fleeing to Canada, or anywhere for that matter, was almost immediately dismissed since she couldn't have left the country without her passport. Law enforcement then focused on the grimmer theory and organized a massive search effort in the river. The search was complicated by the strong current in that area, which could quickly carry a body miles away from the bridge. Divers were deployed, special equipment was used, and police, along with hundreds of volunteers, scoured both banks of the river, looking for remains or any of Sarah's belongings. Among the volunteers actively participating in the search were also Liam and Preston. Unfortunately, despite all efforts, no trace of Sarah was found. Therefore, law enforcement decided to continue questioning people who knew her and were close to her. That's when a peculiar discrepancy emerged. According to friends and classmates, Sarah was not depressed. She was in great spirits, and none had heard about any problems with her father. On the contrary, she always spoke of him warmly and lovingly. However, after Sarah's disappearance, Liam and Preston behaved as if they had lost a close relative, garnering sympathy from many. But soon, people started to notice that their behavior was odd, as if they were performing for an audience. The two had become very close, but this development occurred about a month before the incident. Therefore, the police decided to take a closer look at the friends and re-interview them, the adopted brother of a wealthy heiress. When Liam was brought back to the station for further questioning, he appeared deeply distressed. The investigator inquired once more about his relationship with Sarah and Preston. Liam shared that the three of them grew up on the same street, attended the same school, and were closely knit, sharing their deepest secrets and dreams. Preston even took Sarah to the prom, but there were no romantic feelings between them. Liam mentioned that he and Sarah were not just friends. He considered her his sister. They even listed each other as siblings on their social media profiles. Sarah had no secrets from him, and she had told him that her mother had left her a significant amount of cash, most of which was kept in the safety deposit box. Allegedly, Sarah didn't trust her father, who also claimed a right to the funds, so she stored the money in the bank, but planned to retrieve it soon to run away to Canada. When this story was relayed to Michael Stern, he was quite surprised and offered his version of events. According to him, his wife began saving money for their daughter's future, for education, a wedding, or a home, from the moment Sarah was born. The cash was kept at home, stored in a shoebox, with many bills being old and some quite worn, though no one thought much of it at the time. After his wife passed away, the father handed the box of money to Sarah, advising her to deposit the old and worn bills in the bank. Sarah followed his advice, depositing some of the money into her checking account for everyday expenses and renting a safety deposit box for the rest. She decided to use it to pay for university after finishing college and to travel the world. Michael sternly denied having any claim to the money for his own purposes. What is the best friend hiding? The revelation that the missing student had a large sum of money led investigators to consider the possibility that someone might have targeted her for financial gain. The investigation then decided to check her safety deposit box and bank transactions. It turned out that a few days before disappearing, Sarah had withdrawn a substantial amount from an ATM and had also visited the bank to take out some cash from her box. Another surprise awaited the detectives. Bank surveillance footage revealed that Sarah hadn't gone to the bank alone, but was accompanied by Liam, who obviously knew about Sarah's banking activities. They decided to question Liam again, specifically why he hadn't mentioned this bank visit, which occurred on December 1st. His hesitation was noticeable, but he explained that Sarah trusted no one but him and had asked him to accompany her to the bank because she was afraid to carry a large amount of cash back home. His explanation seemed logical, and his demeanor was natural. Moreover, it was discovered that a house across from the Stern residence had a security camera that captured the street and part of the neighbor's yard. Footage from this camera confirmed that Liam stayed at Sarah's house until 7 in the evening, then left for work and did not return, while the silver sedan left the garage around 11 at night. A plot straight out of a horror movie. About a month after the girl's disappearance, another acquaintance of hers named Anthony, who had been out of town for several weeks and was unaware of the events, walked into the police station with a bizarre and chilling story. It turned out Anthony had been in the same class with Sarah, Liam, and Preston, and after graduating, he dived deep into studying filmmaking, maintaining communication only with Liam, who also had an interest in cinema. Anthony recounted that about a month and a half before Sarah vanished, Liam visited him, and one evening they brainstormed ideas for a horror flick aimed at teenagers. Liam quickly came up with a story about a girl who secretly tells a friend about a large sum of money she possesses. The friend, after gaining her trust and learning all the details, strangles her and dumps her body in a turbulent river. Anthony liked the plot, and they even wrote a couple of pages of the script that evening. However, Anthony soon moved on to another project, forgot about the story, and then left town for a real film shoot where he was working as a camera assistant. Upon his return, Liam unexpectedly called him, inquiring if the police had visited him or summoned him for questioning. Surprised by such questions and learning of Sarah's disappearance and the circumstances surrounding it, Anthony decided to go to the police himself. A horrifying confession. After hearing the new witness's testimony, the authorities suggested Anthony draw Liam into an open conversation and try to elicit a confession from him. Anthony agreed, and a plan was devised. He would invite Liam to collaborate on a project that required renting professional camera equipment, which they ostensibly couldn't afford. Knowing the suspect's aspirations of being in the movie, it was likely he wouldn't miss such an opportunity and might offer the money he took from Sarah. Liam took the bait almost immediately, but suggested they meet in person to discuss the details. A hidden camera was installed in Anthony's car, and he was instructed to carefully coax a confession out of his friend. When the two met, and Liam got into Anthony's car, he looked around cautiously, as if afraid there might be someone else inside. He then handed over an envelope containing $2,000 in old bills, asking if it was enough to rent the filming equipment. Anthony nodded affirmatively, and then inquired where Liam got so much old currency. Liam hesitated, then admitted the money was Sarah's, which he and Preston had taken from her house because the dead don't need it. He didn't go into further details, but his admission was enough for the police to arrest him and Taylor on suspicion of crime. The accomplices tailed. Preston quickly started cooperating with the authorities, striking a deal with the prosecution. He claimed he did not participate in the act itself, but helped his friend cover up the evidence and dispose of the body. According to Preston, Liam began devising plans to take Sarah's money as soon as he learned of its existence. It turned out that Sarah had kept her inheritance a secret even from her best friend for a long time. But when she seriously started planning her trip to Canada, Liam inquired how she intended to fund it, prompting Sarah to reveal the money left by her mother. Liam convinced her that such a sum was safer in a home safe than a bank vault and insisted she withdraw the cash. He even borrowed a significant amount from her right before the tragedy, the same money she had withdrawn from the ATM. When Sarah's father was out of town on a business trip, Liam decided it was time to put his plan into action. He roped in Preston by promising him $25,000. McAtasney decided to handle the dirty work himself, requiring his friend only to help him erase any traces. He convinced Sarah to withdraw the money, failing to check how much she took out. They spent the next day together, with Liam waiting for the right moment. He locked Sarah's dog in another room to prevent it from defending its owner. Approaching her from behind, he began to strangle her. However, the crime proved more challenging than expected. Firstly, the athletic and strong Sarah resisted fiercely, leading to a struggle until she lost consciousness. Secondly, just when he thought she had passed, she would show signs of life. It took the perpetrator about half an hour to be sure Sarah Stern was no longer breathing. Afterward, Liam left her house, heading to work, leaving Preston to step in. He snuck into Sarah's house through the back door, out of the camera's view, dragged the body to the garage, and tidied up the room. A couple of hours later, Liam returned, took a small safe from Sarah's room, placed the body in the car, and drove off in such a way as to avoid being captured by the neighbor's camera. He headed to the bridge where Preston awaited in his own vehicle. Together, they disposed of the body in the river, wiped down the steering wheel, and drove away in Preston's car back to Liam's house to split the loot. They faced a huge disappointment as they found only $10,000 in the safe, not the $100,000 McAtasney had anticipated. However, they decided not to spend the old bills immediately to avoid suspicion. The accomplices buried the safe in a local park, spending only the money Sarah had withdrawn from her account. Trial and verdict. Despite Preston's confession, Liam McAtasney steadfastly denied any wrongdoing, attempting to shift the blame onto his friend. McAtasney's lawyer also insisted on his client's innocence, suggesting Taylor acted alone. Moreover, as the body was never found and the circumstances of the disappearance remained unclear, there was a lingering possibility that Sarah was still alive, having vanished without her documents, money, belongings, or phone. A search of Liam's house turned up nothing except a small key fitting the buried safe, identified by Preston. The trial lasted over 2 years, but despite the absence of a body and McAtasney's confessions, his guilt was established through the combination of evidence. The script described months before the incident, the key to the safe found in his home, his words captured in Anthony's car, and the old bills he handed over. Additionally, fingerprints of both Preston and Liam were found inside the safe, and a colleague testified that McAtasney was absent from work for a few hours that night, asking to be covered. Liam McAtasney was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His accomplice, who did not directly participate in the act, received an 18-year sentence for obstruction of justice and hindering the investigation. Preston Taylor is eligible for parole no sooner than 15 years into his sentence. The body of college student Sarah Stern remains undiscovered to this day.